sometimes in the media it's painted as the bailouts are necessary, that if they don't bail out these corporations, banks, or what have you, it'll get worse. More people would lose their jobs, the whole economy would falter, and it would be complete chaos. So the bailouts are necessary to keep the economy going. So what is the relation of that?
So yeah, so as I highlighted in my presentation, and that's a good point, is that when you can't believe everything you read, right? That the corporate media has a certain bias, because they talked about that, but they didn't really talk about the Occupy and arrest, for example. So in terms of what would did they have to do this or had they have to do that? It's an open question in terms of that. There were serious problems with this crisis, because if they had let the banks collapse, then there would have been a mass sort of chaos in the system. But in the sense that what the bailouts were designed is that the issue is that what comes out of the bailouts is that they went and helped the 1%, right? Is that they didn't care about the people losing their houses and their mortgages and things like that. It just went and saved that. So it would have had harm on the 1%, but they could, if they had taken the right actions, they could have used this opportunity to sort of restore the balance, if you will. Like I said in my presentation, the problem is interest, right? The problem is that compounded interest is doomed to fail. So this type of thing was written in the cards. Babylonians understood this, right? And because they can't get over that, because they didn't wipe the record clean for everybody, this is really the sort of the root problem is the interest of that. So capitalism has fundamental structural problems, and the problem is that unless you address the ideological part, the idea that you can do whatever you want, freedom of ownership, these problems will always be going. So regardless of what they did, as long as they have the same ideological part of the system, they'll always have problems, and that's sort of where people are now.
I was reading an article like I think a week or so ago that was talking about how since the financial crisis the number of billionaires have almost doubled or something. How are they able to do that if the economy is in such a crisis?
Well, that's the point. Is that this $14 trillion was pumped out. Even if they capture a fraction of that, then they're fine, right? Because they were on the right side of the bailouts. It's basically, see, the theory of capitalism is that if you make a bad bet, you pay the price. That's sort of how the theory works, and a lot of the what they call free market fundamentalists would tell you that, right? That this is the problem. They didn't really apply capitalism. They should have let the banks fail, right? That's what a lot of these people like Peter Schiff and people like that would say. But what ended up happening is they got eaten the public trough, right? That 14 trillion that got printed out, they were able to capture that through the bailouts and multi-billion-dollar bonuses. Like if you look at the bonuses that Merrill Lynch, got of this, it would make like I believe one of the outgoing, his name is Thane, I think he got 10 million bonus for proceeding to destroy the world economy, right? And that's was like a lot of the criticism of the bailout was like directed at like these people are on the public trough, yet they still got their bonuses and all that, right? Like AIG had like a retreat where they had a $500,000 retreat where they were all expenses paid with manicures and massages, like to sort out what was happening and then sort of come up with a plan. So what happened was that they weren't punished at all. Like if you imagine you lost $411 billion at your company, as a low-end person, what happened to you? But these guys just got rewarded. So they weren't punished. Instead, that they got to eat at the public trough.
You mentioned the credit rating agencies that rated the CDOs at like a AAA rating, right? So you see Lehman Brothers, they got smoked. Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, all of them went out. But why is nobody pointing fingers at Moody's? How did they get away with it?
Well, it's that the problem is that if you go up, there's so much fraud in the system, is that you basically everyone would go to jail, and that's it's not like I'm not saying what you're saying is wrong, right? But basically what has happened is that there's basically two legal systems, right? There's one for the rich, and then there's one for everyone else, right? So for example, like in they have a stop and frisk rules in so what they do is that there was a guy who was coming home from work, and police came and just stopped him, and he said he's blocking the intersection, the road to his apartment, and there was like no one else on the road, and then so they hauled him off and they put him in jail for that, and he had to pay a $50 fine, right? So what you see in America, you have a police system where they go after people who can't have lawyers and things like that. But on the other hand, when the 1% gets involved, they just pass legal motion after legal motion after legal motion that block any way of getting them and putting them in jail, because they can hire an army of lawyers, and over technicalities they can just drag out the charges so long that there is no real penalties. Like even more egregious is, for example, HSBC. They were working with money launderers, like real money launderers. There was like a system where they would cut, like the tellers would cut a special hole in the wall, so like the drug dealers could just shove the money into the hole because they just want to put it in nice little packages, right? So they had a system like that, and they just had paid a fine, and they didn't go to jail at all, right? And so this concept of the 1% and what Thomas Piketty was saying about how we're returning to an aristocratic era where the rich get away with crimes and everyone else pays. This is what we're really coming to, and that's what's happening. Is that that basically if you have money, you can protect yourself, and everyone else pays the price.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify the question. I meant, for example, if I was to tell you, hey, you know what, you should invest in X and X. So, and for example, you do, and it turns out to be a toxic asset that just tanks in the next month or like the next year. My credibility goes down immediately, and next time I'm like, hey, you need to invest here, you're gonna be like, well, no, right? Like, why would I even want to trust you? But I see Moody's just standing right now, and you see listings, and they still give out the same ratings as they used to. They might be more conservative right now than they were before. But why would you trust someone who went from an AAA rating to an actual B, where, for example, I know they rated stocks for Lehman Brothers at a AAA rating or AAB, but then their stock tanked to like 2 cents the next day.
It's because it goes back to what we were saying, but just like to use a different example, it's like, do you know who Henry Paulson worked for? Who did he work for?
He was one of the board members for Goldman Sachs. I think.
Yeah, he was a CEO of Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
Right? He was CEO of Goldman Sachs. I believe it's Paul. I believe it's Paul Rubin who was Clinton's. He was in Clinton's government. You know who he worked for? Goldman Sachs.
One of the investment banks.
Yeah, Goldman Sachs. So like what you have is these buddies, right? They all get together. They're like I don't know, like that sort of frat boy culture, right? Like it's like these guys have relationships with one another. So the guy that you're prosecuting or the one that you're dating, it's your buddy. So like if your friend makes a mistake, you forgive him, right? Like it's like you might make a mistake, you shouldn't do that again. That was bad, and you did that, right? But that's what it is that this 1% is a very small club, right? And it's very incestuous, right? So it's like they run the system at the end of the day, and it's like, oh, you guys messed up. But what the bigger point was that everyone was in on it. So it wasn't just Fitch. It was like it was everybody. Everyone was making money, and no one wanted to really look at the problems, right? And it's just like basically, oh, that was a stupid time, right? It's just like when everyone gets drunk and they do stupid things, right? It's just that they just forgive that and they just kind of move on, right? They shouldn't have done X, Y, Z at that party. But then, the party's over, and so let's just move on to the next thing, right? And this is endemic. If you read about long-term capital management, which was in the 90s, had a similar problems. John Merriweather, I don't know if anyone takes finance here, but there was this option pricing model called Black-Scholes. So John Merriweather was one of the guys who wrote the paper on that. And, he created long-term capital management. He came up with this idea that we could use quantitative finance and rule the world that way. And so what he bet was that the Russian bonds and the long-term bonds and the short-term bonds were converging. And what ended up happening is that it went the other way, and he destroyed his firm, and it almost destroyed it almost caused a collapse of that. In the next job, he was making a few $100 million again, right? Like it's just that's you mess up, it's your buddy, well, okay, I understand that happens to all of us, so that's fine. So just I'll hire you, and that's just the way the system kind of works. It is alarming, and I'm glad you're alarmed. I'm not saying that you should accept it, but what I'm saying is that this is what my presentation's about, right? It's like, this system is really messed up, and there's no checks and balances, and it's running amok, right? The checks and balances you think are there are not, right? The media does not act as a check. No one's acting, the regulators don't act as a check, right? Because what they passed this Dodd-Frank after the thing, which basically was supposed to fix anything. It does nothing. Like, they removed all the teeth through lobbying. The biggest contributor to Obama's campaign was Goldman Sachs. So, like, I mean, this is the corruption's endemic, right? Like, some of us in this room, we come from like the Muslim lands where we have corruption and endemic. It's the same system. The people who, like, Zardari are hired by, it's the same, like, he's the former prime minister of Pakistan, it's the same guy who's running America, right? So it's like, when you kind of see, like, you know, like, wow, this is like, you're saying that America runs like Pakistan. Well, actually, Pakistan runs like America, right? So this is capitalism. This is what it is. It's a way of life. It's a belief, and it has a perspective, and this is its product. And I understand that you're incredulous, and that's good, but that's unfortunately where we're at.
In the next 10, 20 years, when this cycle will likely perhaps repeat again, do you see anything being different, or do you see any change happening now?
Well, I mean, in terms of, you know, they say the definition of insanity is that you keep trying the same solutions to, you know, to solve the problems, and that's why I really highlighted Alan Greenspan's reaction to crisis, is that the intellectual thinkers are out of solutions, right? They don't want to go to communism because they know communism is a disaster, right? They knew that communism did not work out, right? And that's what I was trying to point out in my discussion, is that the fundamental problem is the belief, right? That you can do whatever you want. Freedom, when you apply it to reality, you're not free. We are bound by physical laws, and you have to eat. It's not a choice to say, oh, you have a choice, worker in Foxconn. You can either jump off the building and kill yourself, or work in these slave-like conditions. That's not really a choice, right? So it's and a lot of people are grappling with this, and I think that the biggest thing that's coming is the sort of the environmental movement, which will make people think. But reading Naomi Klein's latest, it's not. I don't think that the problem is that in the West there's no stomach for real activism anymore, right? Like what I talked to you about in the 30s, for example, when they went after the corporations in terms of protests and stuff like that to get a higher wage. People have been satiated by by this. This is in what I can see, and I hope I'm wrong in the sense I hope people take the affairs into their own hands. But where you really see sort of even Occupy, who inspired Occupy?
I think it was the Arab Spring, wasn't it?
Absolutely, it's the 100th Square, right? And that's where you see sort of, if you look at the resolve in terms of taking on the rulers and the ruling system, you see that more in the Muslim world than you see in the West, right? And that's what the thing is, that for there to be a fundamental change, there has to be real resolve and real desire for sacrifice, because like I said, the Occupy movement, like these spying laws and all these kind of things, they're really directed to the populations in the West. Though Muslims are often the target of that, in sort of the front, because it's easier to sell when it's a brown guy, right? Brown guy, Muslim guy, these kind of spying laws are, for those kind of foreigners, right? But the spy agencies, they crack down on the environmental groups too. They infiltrate the environmental groups, and then this was documented. Like CSIS works for energy companies to spy on natives and environmental groups, right? So the question is that if for the West, like, how are you going to take on the system, right? And that's the big question for them. They're questioning, but do they have the stomach to, like the people like in Syria, for example, who would take on the government there? Like the amount of torture and oppression. Assad has killed 300,000 people. He's displaced 9 million people, and the people still haven't given up. 8,000 arrests in Occupy, and the movement collapses, right? So to change the system, you need a new way of thinking, and it remains to be seen what will happen in the West to do that, because a lot of the policing and all these kind of things are sort of gearing up where they will bring serious sort of oppression to the people if they decide to actually take on the government.
I
hard to talk about the collapse of 2008. Do you believe that the next collapse that is bound to happen from what you're saying, do you think it'd be catastrophic where the government cannot step in and do this quantitative easing and, all these measures to stop,
See, the problem is that, and I'll cover this in my next presentation, is that what you have is a virtual economy, right? Like you have this bubble sort of thing. Like, for example, like one of the simplest things to understand is that money is not based on anything. Like in 1971, Nixon cut the gold window, right? Like before there was a gold-backed currency, America was on gold. You gave $35 US. That was a gold certificate. You get an ounce of gold, right? But then they started cheating on that reserve, and because they were going after the Vietnamese at that time. And so the Russians, the French and the Germans realized, and they started cashing in, right? They're like, you're cheating, we know that, so we gotta get our gold because we gave it to you under this sort of promise, and they betrayed that. And that really was the beginning of the end, right? Really, you decided to go imaginary, right? Because what controls the money supply now? Nothing, just your imagination, right? And so what you see systemically in the capitalist system is that there's a lot of like derivatives are X trillion, $100 trillion more than the actual economy. You have the money supply is not based on anything. You have the stock market. Does it really make sense that if Apple has a building of if I have this this thing is worth $10, how can it be worth $1 million tomorrow, right? That the stock prices when they fluctuate. Yeah, I know I'm an accountant. I know the theory is discounted cash flow model and all that. What I'm saying is that from a reality perspective, it doesn't make sense. If you have X amount of assets, how can it virtually go up and down like that, right? There's a disconnect between the reality and the sort of the perceived what they call the market value, right? So what I'm trying to get at is that systemically capitalism has you have Main Street and the Wall Street kind of aspect, and so far they've been able to keep the two separate and not one affect the others. If there's like for example, if there's a giant earthquake in San Francisco, I think something like that, or if there's political upheaval in China or other part of in other parts of the world, that will puncture a hole in the system that they won't be able to. But it has to be some kind of some kind of reality, where the reality kind of forces that a puncture in that bubble that's permanent. But if it's just just moving stuff around, they've gotten away this time. I don't know how long they'll get away from it. In my humble opinion, it's I think that if there's some kind of massive environmental or political upheaval, that's what will really change things. Sorry, someone in there.
You mentioned about AIG. I was just curious. They came up with the concept of the credit default swaps, right? Who exactly bet against the toxic assets? Was it the firm? Was it firms like Goldman Sachs, or was it people inside the firm?
Sorry.
Who bet against the toxic assets with AIG? I know AIG insured those bonds.
Yeah, there was but I can't remember that. Then I know there was like a couple guys, Geiserman and these guys. It was like there was a few banks that sort of bet on this. I think it was Goldman Sachs who realized that because Goldman Sachs they realized early on these issues, and they started unwinding their subprime toxic assets, and so they got one of the first to get out of them. So I think you're right. I can't remember the name of the banks, but which one it was.
Was it the firms themselves, or was it?
Oh yeah, it was the firms themselves.
Was it the people inside the firms who caught wind of it?
There was a couple investors who realized that this reality. They realized that there was a guy's name, I think is Iserman or something like that. Iserman, like Steve. He was like an independent investor, and so a bunch of these like sort of boutique firms figured it out, and then Goldman Sachs and a couple of the bigger firms, then they sort of realized that this guy was onto something, and so they kind of went in on it, and they bet big, and a lot of people were kind of questioning their bets, and then they won big time, in sort of the downfall. But is it really a surprise that it collapsed? It doesn't make sense rationally. It goes back to what I said about the stock market. It's like you can tell me all of your theories till the cows come home, but it doesn't make sense, right? And that's the sort of the idea with subprime lending, right? It's like, yeah, what they try to say now is that the models were bad. Oh, they didn't include enough data in the models, right? That's why they didn't risk properly against the risk. But it's a flawed idea, right? You can't. Again, a fundamental problem is interest, doesn't work out. Like if you just have banks and farmers, right? Sometimes the farmers can't pay because they had bad crop, right? And so what are they supposed to do? They'll either the society goes to the bank and everyone's just gonna pay them their wages, or you get rid of the banks. That's the only two ways it can go, right?